J'ai encore rêvé d'elle. Choupi, choupidou. Je vais taper une recherche. C'est trop chaud. Je pensais à une chose, mon parcours numérique. Il y a une femme que j'ai envoyée chier qui était plutôt gentille ou toujours été taquine. Je me demande si c'est sa photo. Anastasia. Est-ce que ça existe toujours cette chaîne YouTube? Apparemment, c'est pas la bonne chaîne. Ah, il y avait Eric Pérou qui aimait bien Anastasia Chanel. Terra Tigris Erika. Ah, il s'appelait Erika. Oh, on n'a pas laissé de commentaires dans le film de commentaires d'Eric Pérou. Énorme. C'est bien Gilet jaune sur sa photo de présentation en laissant la même image que depuis toujours. Ah, papy Eric, le nationaliste. Ouais, on était copains à l'époque où moi aussi j'étais nationaliste. Et après, j'ai décidé de dépasser cette notion et d'abattre la nation. Il ne m'a pas suivi sur ce chemin. C'est triste. Anastasia. Je me dis peut-être que c'était Anastasia Chanel, la femme. C'est celle qui. Anastasia Delisi. C'est le genre de femme sans enfant, pas si vieille que ça, mignonne, qui passe dans un couloir. Elle a mis une photo. Putain, on met des images, des vidéos en ce moment. Elle fait 20 vues par vidéo. C'est drôle qu'elle fasse pas beaucoup plus de vues que ça parce que ses montages vidéo sont plutôt bien faits. Elle fait du 100 vues, 200 vues, 400 vues avant. Là, ça sent plus à 20 vues. Ce petit est qu'est-ce qu'elle nous a mis, Anastasia? Anastasia de Lizzie.
Hello, I'm Jim Morrow, author of Crossfiring the Plot to Kill Kennedy. Since 1976, I've taught a course on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Putain, va comprendre, c'est en anglais.
Hello, I'm Jim Morrow, author of Crossfiring the Plot to Kill Kennedy. Since 1976, I've taught a course on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy at the University of Texas at Arlington. Early in 1992, the City Council of Dallas, Texas voted to release complete police department files concerning the assassination. I was one of the first to go over there and begin to go through these files, and frankly, I did not expect to find very much. After all 30 years have gone by, and they've had plenty of time to take things out, add things in, who knows what. But I was very surprised the fact that some of the things that I found in these files. I'll point out right now that they have not yet been gone through thoroughly. There's still perhaps some items of interest still in these files. But today I thought I would share with you some of the files that I have found and point out what some of the importance of these files will be. One of these documents dated May 1960. It's no secret that there's been a definite coolness of the FBI police department following testimony of some of the officers before the Warren Commission studying the Kennedy shooting. These officers are quoted as saying the FBI knew Lee Harvey Oswald was running around loose and not under surveillance. It goes on to say, and this is fact, that the Federal Bureau of Investigation refused to continue training Dallas Police Department officers at the FBI Academy, something they've been doing for 10 years. So J. Edgar Hoover was so upset that happened to mention the true information that they were aware of Oswald and they knew about his presence in Dallas, that they, for some time until the retirement of Police Chief Jesse Curry, they refused to train Dallas police officers. Again, we have questions about the original evidence. We have the original Dallas police evidence sheet, which only shows that they only recovered 2 spent 6.5 millimeter rounds from the Texas School Depository. At the bottom of this sheet, notice it says paraffin test made on Oswald was positive on both hands, negative on the face. The paraffin test was the best test they had at the time for determining if you fired a rifle. And I talked to several experts. I have bolt action rifles of my own, and I can assure you that loose bolt hammer is all camo. If Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 rounds through that thing, every time you pull that bolt back, those gases come back, and his cheek, his right cheek, would been covered with traces of nitro. The paraffin test, which admittedly can be called into question, showed no nitrates on his cheek. Now, what's the most significant about this in the paraffin test is not the test itself, but the fact that when this evidence sheet was reproduced in the Warren Commission volumes, presented to the American public, they had deleted the line about the paraffin test. They simply didn't tell us about it. I find that very significant. Another thing that I found very interesting was the fact that there's several reports in the Dallas police file, again linking Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. Here a source says he talked to the mechanic who worked on Jack Ruby's car. Says that Lee Harvey Oswald drove Jack Ruby's car into his garage to get work done. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Here's a college kid who said that he was working at a health club and met Jack Ruby and was handing out cards for the health club, Jack Ruby's club, and that he was introduced by Jack Ruby to a man that he swears was Lee Harvey Oswald. And this was pretty much confirmed when the Dallas police checked on this, talked to the manager of the health club, and he said, yeah, Jack Ruby was in there all the time. In fact, trying to fix him up with a date with one of his strippers. None of this, of course, was ever mentioned in the Warren Commission. None of this was ever followed up on. We also had a report citing a Dallas cab driver named Raymond Cummings who had contacted Jim Garrison during the time of his investigation and said that he drove Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferry, a man who figured prominently in Garrison's investigation of New Orleans, and a third man to Jack Ruby's club. Now, one of the most intriguing documents is a lengthy copy of the report of the Fort Worth attorney representing one of the police dancers, and who on October the 4th, more than almost 2 months prior to the assassination, was in the Carousel Club talking with his craft, with Jack Ruby and a man that his attorney identifies as Lee Harvey Oswald, sat in the booth next to him and carried on the conversation. Strong evidence indeed that Ruby and Oswald were somehow linked together, but of course the federal investigations have always maintained that they had no connection and didn't know each other. Perhaps some of the most startling information come out of the Dallas police files were these 3 arrest reports on the so-called 3 tramps who were arrested in Deep Plaza. For years, we've known about these men because of news photographs. Right up until 1992, there was nobody who could positively identify these 3 tramps. But now, according to these 3 police reports that were found in the Dallas police files, we are told that 3 tramps are Harold Doyle, John Forrester Gedney, and Gus W. Abrams. If the reports are still in the Dallas police file, and if they were held for 3 or 4 days, why is it that the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee and the FBI, and all this massive federal investigation, can't seem to look at it? Of course, the most startling piece of evidence found in the Dallas police files is the discovery of one of the backyard photographs, a famous photograph of Oswald holding his rifle, wearing a pistol, and holding up behind his head, standing in the backyard of his home on Ellsworth Street. Well, now, in the Dallas police files, we found a photograph of the backyard with no one in it. We find a photograph of the backyard with a Dallas Brown standing in it in pose. And we find a backyard photograph with a white cutout map of Lee Harvey Oswald. This would be the in-between step from taking a photograph with no figure in it to a photograph with a picture of Oswald superimposed over the backyard, exactly as he told the Dallas police. So there's something very strange going on with these photographs, and it lends credibility to the people who have been saying all along, adding their voices to Lee Harvey Oswald, that they are a phony photograph used to incriminate him in the assassination. So as you can see, there's plenty of information in these Dallas police files, and there may be more yet to come. The thing that excites me is that if this amount of information is available here in Dallas, just think what we might be able to find in the files of the CIA and the FBI. The time has come to open those files and to let the American people see what has happened to them, what happened to their president in 1960. Thank you.
Je cherche la merde. C'est ton jamais. Ah, il est rigolo ce petit commentaire que je lui laisse. Bon. 9 membres en ligne du network. Et c'est le drapeau du Venezuela qu'on voit là. Ah non, c'est le drapeau de Cuba ça. C'est le drapeau de quoi? C'est le drapeau de Cuba qu'elle a mis dans son drapeau. Ah, Cuba, c'est une belle ville avant d'être asservie alors. Alors, à quoi ressemble le Discord de Mademoiselle Anastasia? Ouais, on va l'imaginer parfaite, tu vois. Sans enfants, sans mari, sans rien. C'est Mademoiselle Anastasia. De Lizzie. Bon, après, moi, je suis un débris, une épave. Et qui sait? Moi, je dis, cette photo, elle est plutôt mignonne. Si je remettais sa photo en fond d'écran. Ah, ça pourrait peut-être l'embêter. Ah, mais quel homme n'embête pas sa femme? C'est pas ta femme, Anastasia? C'est vrai. C'est la femme de qui alors? Ah, ça, c'est une question qui se pose. C'est la femme de qui, Anastasia? Si c'est la femme de personne, ah, c'est-à-dire c'est la premier arrivé, premier service. C'est comme ça que ça marche, les femmes. Ah, mais je suis pas le premier arrivé. Voilà. J'ai tard un quiz ce matin. Ah, je retrouve plus, j'avais mis où sa photo? Putain. Chaque fois j'ai des photos et je sais pas où je les mets. Anastasia, ça c'est une rock. Je sais même pas c'est qui. Je crois qu'elle vient de Roumanie, elle était plutôt jolie. Une Prover. Ça c'est moi qui passe chez Dieudonné. Dieudonné, il a pris mon image et lui sur son truc. C'est rigolo ça. Ah, bon, j'avais une chienne et même la chienne elle s'est barrée. Pas qu'une femme va rester. Voilà. Voilà. Voilà, voilà, Anastasia. Alors, est-ce qu'Anastasia. Ouais, j'aurais pas dû t'enlever là. Ah ouais, donc ton papa est français et ta maman est américaine. Ça veut dire que tu as des gènes qui ont succombé au mal français. Peut-être le seul point positif que dans l'histoire. Imagine, je te rappelle ton père et tout. Non, je déconne. Parler anglais. Bon, le mien aussi, il parlait anglais. Moi, j'ai toujours eu un problème avec les Anglais, les autres dialectes. Yorana, j'aurais voulu apprendre à parler tahitien. Ouais, c'est un jour, je finis la tahiti. Hé, Anastasia, je sais même pas comment t'appeler normalement. T'appelles vraiment Anastasia. De Lizzie. C'est quoi l'origine de Lizzie? Anastasia de Lizzie. De Lizzie, ça vient de Lizzie. Élevage de Lizzie. Non, tu l'appelles pas Anastasia de Lizzie. Ce serait bon. Présent 358 fois sur Genève. Il y en a une qui s'appelle Anastasia. Alphonse, Anne. Anne de Lizy. J'avoue que Anne de Lizy, ça fait penser à quelque chose. Et il donne pas l'origine, l'histoire et tout. Des fois, il y a une petite histoire sur. Il ne donne pas la petite histoire rigolote. Et c'est où Lizy? C'est un rapport avec des chevaux, Lizy. C'est une cavalière. Ah ouais, dans la recherche de Lizy, elle pète son portrait. C'est même l'image originale, j'ai l'impression. Elle est même en meilleure définition que celle que je t'ai grattée. Hop là. Copier l'adresse et l'image. Enregistrer l'image. Name it. On va la nommer. Anastasia de Lys. Ouais, ce matin, je pensais à toi, je sais pas pourquoi. Peut-être que ce matin, tu pensais à moi sans savoir pourquoi. Alors, toi, ce matin, si tu t'es mis à penser à moi, c'est parce que moi, j'ai écrit un commentaire. Ah. Elle est jolie, hein? Elle a les yeux fermés. Pourquoi elle a les yeux fermés? Un beau petit nez en trompette. Je la veux bien dessinée, un peu autoritaire, avec un rictus sur le côté qui a une tendance à redescendre. Apparemment, sur la photo, elle a voulu faire quelque chose de sérieux. Pas de petits sourires et tout. L'air sérieux. Un regard éteint, une expression déçue. C'est l'air de la déception que je vois sur cette image. J'ai été méchant avec elle. En même temps, j'ai jamais été gentil avec les filles. Ah si, j'étais gentil un moment avec les filles, mais quand j'ai vu que je me suis fait plier par les filles avec qui j'étais gentil, je me suis mis à être méchant avec les filles. On pourrait croire que j'ai le même raisonnement qu'une femme. La femme qui a été gentille avec les hommes, qui s'est fait tordre par les hommes et qui est devenue méchante avec l'autre sexe. Oh, on pourrait facilement partager une vie à ses côtés. Elle pourrait même être muette, ça irait très bien. J'imagine qu'elle parle un peu. Une maman américaine. Et je me demande c'est quoi comme type d'américaine. Qu'est-ce qu'aurait pu te donner vraiment joli. Est-ce que c'est bien son image? Je crois que c'est bien son image. Je crois qu'elle ressemble à ça. Le truc qui est le plus drôle, c'est que je l'ai insulté disant ouais, tu fais chier. Il lui casse les couilles à José. Lui, au moins, il monte sa gueule. Il assume et tout. Ouais, tu te caches. Comme n'importe lequel de ces trolls sur Internet. Tu pourrais être un homme. J'ai un peu piqué, quoi, Anastasie. Et qu'est-ce que je vois un an plus tard? Une photo personnalisée sur son truc, où il y a des chances que ce soit elle. C'est ça veut dire que je l'ai piqué au vif. Même si elle dit de tout son être, c'est pas à cause de Till que j'ai mis mon image sur Internet. Moi, je crois que j'en suis un peu pour quelque chose. Ah là là, Anastasia. C'est vrai, je ne suis pas le chanteur de tes rêves, j'ai une voix de merde. Déjà, c'est un mauvais départ. Quand ta femme n'apprécie pas ta voix, c'est la merde. Peut-être qu'en réalité, il serait utile que j'apprenne à maîtriser ma voix. Assortie à la tonalité qu'il faut pour te faire frissonner le bout de l'oreille. Qu'est-ce qu'il fait? Il est en train de draguer Anastasia par vidéo interposée. Il lui a même pas laissé le lien de la vidéo. Ah ouais, je vais pas lui mettre le lien de la vidéo. Quoique, peut-être. Non, il est trop nul. Il faudrait que je fasse une vidéo spéciale Anastasia. Ou un truc encore plus drôle, du genre, après avoir pris sa douche avec elle, il lui déclare sa femme. Sa femme, sa flamme. Ouais, j'ai pris une douche avec toi, Anastasia, il me semble. Il dit, va à la douche. Je suis allé à la douche. Ouais, si je pourrais te dire un truc genre, va à la douche avec moi. Pourquoi pas? Elle dit tout. Tu habites aux États-Unis, tu habites en France, tu habites à Cuba. Elle a mis un drapeau de Cuba. Ressortissante cubaine, alors? Hola, ¿qué tal, guapa? ¿Cómo estás? ¿Qué onda? Chiquita. Là, j'ai un peu oublié les mots, mais c'est vrai. No sé lo que puedo decir. Necesito. Es- Eso. estoy. Necesito Enfin bref, l'espagnol, de toute façon, est aussi corrompu que le français, étant donné qu'au Mexique, ils leur ont fait oublier le maya. Ah non, à ce qui paraît, il y en a plein qui continuent à parler maya. Mais la langue espagnole du continent sud-américain, en réalité, appauvrit les diversités culturelles, encore une fois, et la diversité de langage de la planète. Elle est mignonne. Franchement, moi, je la trouve mignonne. Je t'avoue, mais moi, je la trouve vraiment très mignonne. Bon, s'il faut, elle est encore amoureuse de Christophe, ça c'est la merde. Bon, ben, c'est triste. C'est triste. C'est triste. Je vous souhaite de beaux enfants, d'être heureux jusqu'à la nuit des temps. Si elle est célibataire sans enfant, elle mérite qu'on. T'as une dot de combien, Anastasia? Dis-moi tout, tu coûtes combien, Anastasia? Il est pas gentil. En réalité, je suis très gentil. Qu'est-ce que je pourrais bien faire? Qu'est-ce que je pourrais bien faire? Je sais pas ce que je pourrais bien faire. Qu'est-ce que je pourrais... Ah ouais, je sais ce que je pourrais faire. Je crois que quand tu fais un truc comme ça, Annie, ajouter des contacts, copier-coller le lien. Quand tu fais ça, on va faire ça dans une autre vidéo pour rigoler. On va même te lâcher un j'aime, même si je comprends pas tes vidéos. Elle a pas affiché les j'aime de sa vidéo.
I've always felt very threatened. You know, a lot of folks that gave testimony are no longer around to give testimony any longer. I
didn't want to be
I didn't want to be one of those people that shot myself in the back of the head with a shotgun. One night in particular, I recall about 2 weeks prior to the assassination, being in the club. Parking lot separated his club, the carousel, and the club that I worked at, the Colony Club.
Je crois que quand Anastasia parle anglais, elle parle comme ma femme.
Colony Club would go over to Jack's Club and watch their show, and in their show breaks, they would come and watch our show. So I had trotted over there that night and was watching the show, and there was a girl that danced there by the name of Jada. And she was sitting at the table with Jack Ruby and another man, and I went and sat down with them to have a drink. As I sat down at the table, Ruby introduced me to the man sitting there at the table with he and Jada, and he said, "Beverly, this is my friend Lee." And after Jack Ruby went into the police station and killed Lee Harvey Oswald, it was then that I realized this was the man that I had met in the club 2 weeks prior to the assassination of Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby were linked together. And I don't know how, and probably I never will. But I know in my heart that man, Lee Harvey Oswald, or the person that was shot in the basement of the police station, was the man that was in the pub 2 weeks prior to the assassination. As a matter of fact, the next day, Jada gave an interview to the newspaper, and she said the same thing that I'm saying to you now. that she met Oswald 2 weeks prior to the assassination of Kennedy. However, unfortunate it is, Jada is dead, or so they tell me.
J'arrive sur son Discord et il y a marqué un truc du genre oh mon dieu, Till est là. Ça ressemble, c'est trop bien.
Sur les enfants, moi j'ai fait l'expérience de mon gamin malade que je ne voulais pas emmener chez le pédiatre parce que c'était tout le temps à moi de l'emmener chez le pédiatre. J'ai dit à son père tu t'en charges. Il ne me l'a pas fait à temps. Le gamin a fini avec un tampon percé quand même et la crèche qui m'a appelé pour dire il est ici, etc. Ce que j'ai fait.
Ta gueule. Bon, elle fait 2 vues aussi. Méchant. Elle n'est pas de pub comme lui. Et il travaille bénévole. Si on me balançait la playlist Anastasia Chanel. On est là.
Did you ever speak to Lee Oswald in your life? Never have. Never. I never used the term angry. That's not in my vocabulary.
What did you say about angry in school?
I mean, it's not in my vocabulary. It isn't my.
This is the word angry?
Yes, I mean, it was used constantly here with reference to how I felt. Matter of fact, I was more remorseful than angry as I lost.
What do you, specifically what are you referring to now? The president?
Yeah. Tell us how you felt about it.
And understand how a great man like that can be lost. Those words from Ruthie.
There indeed is a connection between Jack Ruby and Lee Oswald. And in some manner of speaking, Oswald's murder was to shut him up.
Do you know Lee Oswald? Have you ever seen him? To my knowledge, if I recollect correctly, I saw him in the audience last week. Lee Oswald in the audience at the club, at the Castle Club, which is owned by Jack Ruby, sir.
Did you ever speak to Lee Oswald in your life? Never have. Never. I never used the term angry. That's not in my vocabulary.
What did you say about angry in school?
I mean, it's not in my vocabulary. It isn't my.
This is the word angry?
Yes, I mean, it was used constantly here with reference to how I felt.
Putain, ils y sont tous.
I was more remorseful than angry.
Ça, je sais plus qui c'est, mais ça me dit quelque chose.
Specifically what are you referring to now?
Ah, je vois pas qui c'est, lui. Là, c'est Papy Eric. Galaxie Ferré, il connaît pas. Atome nucléaire. L'atome.
Can't understand how a great man like that
Très longtemps, l'atome, je connais pas.
Well, it started off beautiful, as a matter of fact. Started off Stanford Spirit. Got up and were he was jubilant about the reception he had. See, Fort Worth, this was the third stop. Everywhere we had tremendously enthusiastic, warm crowds. Couldn't help it. So we were looking forward actually to coming to Dallas. We were all eagerly awaiting the arrival in Dallas, which we talk about much, as you may know, because it's not a very long flight. It's 707 Fort Worth to Dallas. And Dallas had a wonderful reception at the airport. Extremely pleased. Tremendous crowd at the airport. We shook hands with a lot of people. We started the cavalcade downtown. So I would say that everyone was extremely good spirits, high spirits, and particularly I think this Kennedy had very much warmed to this type of affair. As we came down, as we came through the residential area of Dallas, the crowd thinned a little bit. We talked again. He was extremely pleased with the reception that they had. As we neared downtown Dallas, the crowds became enormous and extremely enthusiastic. We came down to the main business district of Dallas. I would say we received as warm, as enthusiastic, as spontaneous reception as we did in the city and the state. It was really wonderful. To the point where just as we turned down by the courthouse, Nellie turned around and said to the president, she was so
présent sur le même serveur, c'est méchant.
Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas wasn't lucky too.
Ah, j'ai peut-être été bloqué par Anastasia Chanel.
The crowds began to thin. Only about 5 minutes. Trademark held. So we all more or less straightened up in the car. I did, I know. Maybe I should explain that a little bit by saying that we were sitting for a long period of time, we were facing one direction. College crowd. When you get an opportunity with the crowd thing, you shift the chair, straighten up, and we had just done that. I had, and I heard the shot. I say shot because I immediately thought it was a shot. It was the rifle. Fear just swept through me, and I turned, thinking that the shot had come back over my right shoulder.
Ah, je vais capturer la bande son.
So I turned, and I obviously saw nothing but a tremendous crowd of people from where it's come. And I saw nothing unusual, nothing out of the way, except people also had startled looks on their faces. They were turning, they were looking, and I didn't catch him in the corner of my eye. So I was in the process of turning to my left, and that's when I felt the impact of the bullet that hit me. Went in my back shoulder and came out my chest right here. I felt as if someone had just hit me in the back, a sharp blow with a doubled up fist. It more or less knocked me over, at least enough to where I looked down, and of course I was covered with blood, and frankly thought that I had been fatally hit. I never lost consciousness, and I was lying there and heard the third shot. I heard the third shot very distinctly. I heard it hit. I assumed that it hit the president. It obviously did. The evidence was splattered all over the car and all over my clothes and all over Nellie, and it was a time of just unbelievable stark tragedy. So many things go through your mind at that moment that I think it's probably impossible to relate at any future time, all the things that you thought. I know I thought, again, I rather assumed, without knowing, that the president had been fatally wounded. And I rather assumed that I had been. And so constantly there was going through my mind thoughts of Nellie, of the children, of what you'd done. And it's really difficult, I think, to try to explain all the things that you wonder about, all the things that you concern yourself with at a time like that.
Governor Conley, what are your recollections of those terrible moments when you and President Kennedy were shot?
Martin, just before it occurred, of course, we'd had a great morning in Fort Worth, a magnificent breakfast. He spoke in a slight drizzle. We made the trip to Dallas, huge throngs along the way. We got into downtown Dallas with a tremendous crowd, real warmth, real understanding, real appreciation. And Nellie and I saw it so vividly because we were riding in the car with them. We did not attempt to acknowledge the obvious ovation that they were getting because we knew it was for the Kennedys. The reception has been magnificent. The president had remarked on it, so had Miss Kennedy. As a matter of fact, I guess not 30 seconds before the tragic incident occurred, that Nellie had turned to the president and said, "Mr. President, they can't make you believe now that there are not some in Dallas who love you and appreciate you, can they?" And he said, "No, we sure can't." And then we had just turned the corner. We heard a shot. I turned to my left. I was sitting in the jump seat. I turned to my left to look in the back seat. The president had slumped. He had said nothing. Almost simultaneously, as I turned, I was hit. And I knew I'd been hit badly. And I said, I knew the president had been hit, and I said, "My God, they're going to kill us all." And then there was a third shot, and the president was hit again. And we thought then very seriously. I had still regained consciousness, but the president had slumped in Miss Kennedy's lap. And when he was hit the second time, she said, or the first time, it all happened in such a brief span, she said, "Oh my God, they killed my husband." I said, Jack. And then after the third shot, the next thing that occurred, I was conscious. The Secret Service man, of course, the chauffeur had pulled out of the line. They said, "Get out of here." On the radios, they said, "Get us to a hospital immediately." And so we pulled out, of course, immediately as fast as we could go and got to the hospital. In the space of a few seconds, it's unbelievable what can happen. Martin, we went from great joy, anticipation, wonderful crowds, wonderful throngs, to great tragedy.
Governor, what are the thoughts that have come to you as you've lain here in this hospital bed recovering from your wound?
Well, Martin, there have been many and many subjects. And I just wonder, you wonder all types of things. You wonder why his life was taken, why my life was spared. And I know, of course, that some now speculate that, well, it was me the man was after, not him. Of course, I have been campaigning all over Texas, all last year for 11 months, all this year, riding parades, horseback, in cars, open cars, on street corners. I could have been an easy prey for anyone with no security, whatever. So I don't place any stead in this, except I think the man did what he intended to do, shoot both of us. And that's the only thing I can think.
What other reflections have you had, Governor?
Only that maybe, Martin, that the President of the United States, as a result of this great tragedy, has been asked to do something in death he couldn't do in life. And that is to so shock and so stun the nation, and the people, and the world, of what's happening to us, of the cancerous growth that's being permitted to expand and enlarge itself upon the community and the society in which we live, that breeds a hatred, a bigotry, an intolerance, an indifference, a lawlessness that is, I think, really an outward manifestation of what occurred here in Dallas. It could have occurred in any other city in America. It is nothing more than a manifestation of an extremism on both sides that basically is the genesis of our self-destruction if we're ever going to be destroyed. I am not the least fearful of any foreign enemy, as long as we have within ourselves not hate, but human understanding, not passion and prejudice, but reason and tolerance, and not ignorance, but knowledge, and the willingness to use that knowledge. This is the only answer I can give Martin why he's gone and I'm not.
The following was recorded on August the 17th, 1963 by William K. Stuckey in New Orleans, Louisiana. Material is subject to copyright by William K. Stuckey, 1963. Narrator is William K. Stuckey, 2317 State Street, New Orleans, Louisiana. This is the first of a series of Latin listening post interviews with persons more or less directly concerned with the conflict between the United States and Cuba. In subsequent programs, we will present talks with people who are connected with the Cuban refugee organizations, people who are connected with President Batista, and U.S. citizens with direct stakes in the outcome of the Cuban situation. Tonight we have with us a representative of probably the most controversial organization connected with Cuba in this country. The organization, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The person, Lee Oswald, Secretary of the New Orleans Chapter to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. This organization has long been on the Justice Department's blacklist and is a group which is generally considered to be the leading pro-Castro body in the nation. As a reporter of Latin American affairs in the city for several years now, your columnist has kept a lookout for local representatives of this pro-Castro group. None appeared in public view until this week, when young Lee Oswald was arrested and convicted for disturbing the peace. He was arrested while passing out pro-Castro literature to a crowd which included several violently anti-Castro Cuban refugees. When we finally tracked Mr. Oswald down today and asked him to participate in Latin Listening Post, he told us frankly that he would because it may help his organization attract more members in this area. With that in mind, and knowing that Mr. Oswald must have had to demonstrate a great skill in dialectics before he was entrusted with his present post, we now proceed on the course of random questioning of Mr. Oswald. Mr. Oswald, if I may, how long has the Fair Play for Cuba Committee had an organization in New Orleans?
We have had members in this area for several months now. Up until about 2 months ago, however, we have not organized our members into any sort of active group. Until, as you say, this week, we have decided to feel out the public what they think of our organization, our aims. And for that purpose, we have been, as you say, distributing literature on the street for the purpose of trying to attract new members and feel out the public.
Do you have any other activities other than distributing literature at the present time?
Well, I assume you mean, do I have any organizational duties myself?
Yes.
Yes, as secretary, I'm responsible for the keeping of records and the protection of the members' names so that undue publicity or attention will not be drawn to them if they do not desire it. My duties are as the duties of a secretary of any organization. Our organization has that undue publicity or attention will not be drawn to them if they do not desire it. My duties are as the duties of a secretary of any organization. Our organization has a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. The duties of those people would be more or less self-evident. Those then are my duties. I do not, however, belong to any other organization at all.
Are you at liberty to reveal the membership of your organization?
No, I'm not.
For what reason?
Well, as secretary, I believe it's standard operating procedure that an organization consisting of a political minority protect the names and addresses of its members. And I have that is my duty, and I have every reason to do that.
Mr. Oswald, there are many commentators in the journalistic field in this country that equate the Fair Play for Cuba Committee with the American Communist Party. what you're feeling about this, and are you a member of the American Communist Party?
Well, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, with its headquarters at 799 Broadway in New York, has been investigated by the Senate subcommittees who are occupied with this sort of thing. They have investigated our organization from the viewpoint of taxes, subversion, allegiance, and in general where and how and why we exist. They have found absolutely nothing to connect us with the Communist Party of the United States. In regards to your question about whether I myself am a communist, as I said, I do not belong to any other organization.
I noticed from your pamphlets that one bears the title Hands Off Cuba. I'm curious as to whether or not this applies to the Soviet Union as well as to the United States.
This organization is not occupied at all with the problem of the Soviet Union or the problem of international communism. Hands Off Cuba is the main slogan of this committee. It means, it follows our first principle, which has to do with non-intervention. In other words, keeping your hands off a foreign state, which is supported by the Constitution and so forth and so on. We have our own non-intervention laws. That is what Hands Off Cuba means. As I say, we are not occupied at all with the problem of the Soviet Union.
Does your group believe that the Castro regime in Cuba is not actually a front for a Soviet colony in the Western Hemisphere?
Very definitely. Castro is an independent leader of an independent country. He has ties with the Soviet Union, with the Eastern Bloc. However, I think it's rather obvious as to why and when and where, because of the fact that we certainly don't have any trade with him. We are discouraging trade with that country, with our allies and so forth. So, of course, he has to turn to Russia. That does not mean, however, that he is dependent upon Russia. He receives trade from many countries, including Great Britain to a certain extent, France, certain other powers in the Western Hemisphere. He is even trading with several of the more independent African states. So that you cannot point at Castro and say that he is a Russian puppet. He is not. He is an independent person, an independent leader of his country. And I believe that was pointed out very well during the October crisis, when Castro very definitely said that although Premier Khrushchev had urged him to have on-site inspection at his rocket bases in Cuba, that Fidel Castro refused.
Do you feel that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee would maintain its present line as far as supporting President or Premier Castro if the Soviet Union broke relations with the Castro regime in Cuba?
We do not support the man. We do not support the individual. We support the idea of an independent revolution in the Western Hemisphere, free from American intervention. We do not support, as I say, the individual. If the Cuban people destroy Castro, or if he is otherwise proven to have betrayed his own revolution, that will not have any bearing upon this committee. We are a committee who do believe that Castro has not so far betrayed his own country.
Do you believe that the Castro regime is a communist regime?
They have well, they have said that they are a Marxist country. On the other hand, so is Ghana, so is several other countries in Africa. Every country which emerges from a sort of a feudal state, as Cuba did, experiments usually in socialism, in Marxism. For that matter, Great Britain has socialized medicine. You cannot say that Castro is a communist at this time because he has not developed his country, his system, so far. He has not had the chance to become a communist. He is an experimenter, a person who is trying to find the best way for his country. If he chooses a socialist or a Marxist or a communist way of life, that is something upon which only the Cuban people can pass. We do not have the right to pass on that. We can have our own opinions, naturally, but we cannot exploit that system and say it is a bad one, it is a threat to our existence, and then go in and try to destroy it. That would be against our principles of democracy.
As a representative of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, do you feel that capitalism in any form, or at least capitalism as we know it, has any place in the future of Cuba?
Well, so far, the situation has developed where that it is irrevocably lost as far as Cuba is irrevocably lost as far as capitalism goes. There will never be a capitalist regime again in Cuba. Cuba may go the way of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, or it may go the way to the other extreme, the way of China. In other words, a dogmatic communist system. That depends on how we handle the matter here in the United States.
Does the Fair Play for Cuba Committee have any particular position in the Cuban, or rather the Chinese and Russian conflict? Has it taken sides as opposed to China's position in this conflict, or as opposed to Russia's position?
Well, no, we do not pass on international situations of that sort. As the name implies, Fair Play for Cuba Committee, we are occupied only with the one narrow point of Cuba, the problem of Cuba and what it is to us. We are not occupied at all with the problems of the Sino-Russian or the Yugoslavian Russian problems whatsoever.
I have here with me tonight various pieces of literature that Mr. Oswald has been distributing on street corners here in the last week. I'd like to read to you some of the titles. The first is a yellow handbill entitled Hands Off Cuba. Join the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, New Orleans Charter Member Branch. There's another pamphlet by the name of, quote, The Revolution Must Be a School of Unfettered Thought, Fidel Castro. There's still another pamphlet entitled Fidel Castro Denounces Bureaucracy and Sectarianism, and a fourth pamphlet entitled Ideology and Revolution by Jean-Paul Sartre. I'm curious about a fifth pamphlet, however, Mr. Oswald. This to me was the most interesting. It's entitled The Crime Against Cuba by Carlos Lamont. The theme of this pamphlet is the fact that the U.S. was committed a grave injustice when it backed the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Now, it has probably a complete ideology here for the national liberation movement type of philosophy that we hear a lot of in the new countries. Picking among the paragraphs, I see one here that I'd like to hear Mr. Oswald's comment on, and I'd like to quote. It is well to recall that the national emergency proclaimed by President Truman in 1950 during the Korean War is still in effect in the United States and has been utilized constantly for the curtailment of civil liberties. What's your comment about the veracity of this statement?
Well, of course, that is the last paragraph of a very long page. That has to do with the fact that propaganda in the United States has slanted and shown Cuba and Castro to be in a very bad light. Now, they have mentioned, the U.S. government has mentioned, that Castro has declared an emergency in Cuba. He has not held elections, for instance, because of the fact that there is an emergency situation in Cuba. Now, the Castro government, in declaring that, is doing just what this book points out. It is doing what we did in 1950. And you recall what happened in 1950? That was during the beginning of the Korean War, when we felt that we were going to be in a very, very dangerous situation. We adopted an emergency law which restricted newspapers, broadcasters, radio and TV from giving any opinions, any comments which were not already checked out by certain administrative bureaus of the United States government. That was under our emergency. At this time, Fidel Castro has his emergency. It is because of us and our attitude, and because of the attitude of certain other people, certain other countries in Latin America and certain other countries. This then is the parallel which this paragraph is talking about. An emergency in our country at that time and an emergency in their country at this time.
Mr. Oswald, this is very interesting to me to find out about the restrictions on newspapers in 1950, because I was in the newspaper business at that time. Mm-hmm. I don't recall seeing any such government bureau established in my office to tell us what to print. Exactly what do you have a reference to?
Well, I have reference to the obvious fact that during wartime, haphazard guesses and information are not given out by anyone in regards to military or strategical comments, such as comments or leaks about new fronts or movements and so forth. News was controlled at that time to that extent, as it is always controlled during a war or a national emergency, always.
Do you feel that news is controlled in the United States today regarding Cuba?
It is a self-control, yes, imposed by most newspapers. Of course, I don't know whether I'm being fair, but of course I would have to point to the Times-Picayune States Island Syndicate, since it is the only paper we have in New Orleans, and a very restrictive paper. The Fair Play Cuba Committee has often approached this paper with information or comments, and this paper has consistently refused because of the fact that it is sympathetic to the anti-Castro regime. It is systematically refused to print anything objective, anything giving the other man's viewpoint about Cuba.
Would you care to list the dates of the persons that you talked to in papers that refused to print them?
I do not know the name of the reporter. I did speak to the city editor. I spoke to him 1 week ago, and I spoke to him yesterday, Friday, which was immediately after our demonstration, when I and several other of my members had a demonstration in front of the International Trade Mart, which was filmed by WDSU TV and shown last night on the news. At that time, at 2 o'clock, I went to the Times-Picayune, informed them of our demonstration, which was very well covered by WDSU TV, and they told me at that time that due to the fact that they were not sympathetic to this organization or to the aims and ideals of this organization, they would not print any information that I gave them. They did say that if I would care to write a letter to the editor, they might put that in the letter to the editor column.
Mr. Oswald, does it make any difference to you if any of the activities of the local branch of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee benefit the Communist Party or the goals of international communism?
Does it make any... Yeah. Well, that is what I believe you would term a loaded question. However, I will attempt to answer it. It is inconsistent with my ideals to support communism, my personal ideals. It is inconsistent with the ideals of the Fair Play for Cuba committee, to support the ideals of international communism. We are not occupied with that problem. We are occupied with the problem of Cuba. We do not believe, under any circumstances, that in supporting our ideas about Cuba, our pro-Castro, as you call them, ideals, we do not believe that that is inconsistent with believing in democracy. Quite the contrary. We believe it is a necessity in supporting democracy to support Fidel Castro and his right to make his country any way he wants to. Not so much the right to destroy us. Of course, we have our rights about defense. In other words, we do not feel that we are supporting international communism or communism in supporting Fidel Castro.
What other political leaders in Latin America today do you feel fulfill the Fair Play for Cuba Committee's requirements for a democratic political leader?
Well, you know, there's a funny story about Latin America. It goes something like this: coffee, bananas, sugar, and a few other products. In other words, that refers to the so-called banana countries, countries which like Cuba, up to this time, had a one-crop agriculture, one-crop economy. And where did those go? They went to the United States. Now, the attitude of those countries who are controlled by the United States, whose economy depends almost 100% upon how much money the United States pours into them, those countries cannot be expected to give an independent viewpoint on Cuba or Castro. The few countries which abstained at certain international inter-American meetings during the last year are those countries which are big enough to support themselves, those countries being only Brazil, Argentina, and perhaps in some cases the Democratic Republic of Costa Rica, which is, by the way, the only democratic republic in all of Central America.
What is your definition of democracy?
My definition, well, the definition of democracy. That's a very good one. That's a very controversial viewpoint. You know, it used to be very clear, but now it's not. You know, when our forefathers drew up the Constitution, they considered that democracy was creating an atmosphere of freedom, of discussion, of argument, of finding the truth. The rights of, well, the classic right of having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In Latin America, they have none of those rights, none of them at all. And that is my definition of democracy. The right to be in a minority and not to be suppressed. The right to see for yourself without government restrictions. Such countries as Cuba, and we are, by the way, restricted from going to Cuba.
Mr. Oswald, when was the last time you were in Latin America?
I've been only to Mexico in my life, sir. I'm not fully acquainted with Latin America personally, but then I'm not the president of this organization either. I'm merely a volunteer, a secretary of this local chapter. I do not claim to be an expert on Latin America, but then very few people do. Certainly, it is obvious to me, having been educated here in New Orleans, and having been instilled with the ideas of democracy and objectiveness, that Cuba and the right of the Cubans to self-determination is more or less self-evident. And one does not have to travel through Central and South America. One does not have to see the poverty in Chile or Peru, or the suppression of democratic liberties by the Samoa brothers in Nicaragua, in order to draw one's conclusion about Cuba.
Does the Fair Play for Cuba Committee have any opinion about the suppression of democratic liberties in Hungary in 1956, or the poverty in any of the Eastern Bloc countries today?
Officially, no, but of course we have our own opinions about such situation. We consider that Russian imperialism is a very bad thing. It was a bad thing in Hungary. We certainly do not support dictatorship or the suppression of any peoples anywhere. But as I say, and as I must stress, we are preoccupied only with the problem of Cuba officially.
We'll return for more questions after this message. Mr. Oswald, you have the title of Secretary of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. However, you just said that you've never been to Latin America except for a few ventures into Mexico. In that case, just exactly how do you get your information concerning Latin American affairs or Latin American conditions?
Well, as I say, we are preoccupied with the problem of Cuba. There are correspondents, people who correspond with the headquarters in New York from Cuba, directly from Cuba. That is where they get their information about Cuba. Now, in regards to Latin and Central America, you do not have to be you do not have to have your own correspondent there. The AP and the UP cover it very well, and they certainly give a very clear picture of the situation in certain countries, Nicaragua and so forth, as I mentioned, which have very undemocratic regimes, dictatorships. And as I say, these things are well known by everyone, and they accepted it as truth. For instance, you will not be able to find any official or any person who knows about Latin America who will say that Nicaragua does not have a dictatorship.
Very interesting that you should mention dictatorships in Nicaragua, because we naturally, from reading your press, have heard about these dictatorships for many, many years. But it's curious to me as to why no Nicaraguans fled to the United States last year, whereas we had possibly 50 to 60,000 Cubans fleeing from Cuba to the United States. Yeah. What is the Fair Play for Cuba Committee's official reply to this?
Well, a good question. Nicaraguan situation is one considerably different from Cuba. People are not inclined to flee their countries unless some new system, some new factor enters into their lives. I must say that very surely into the Nicaragua, no new factors have entered for about 300 years. In fact, the people live exactly how they have always lived in Nicaragua. I'm referring to the overwhelming majority of people in Nicaragua, which is a feudal dictatorship with 90% of the people engaged in agriculture. These peasants are uneducated. They have one of the lowest living standards in all of the Western Hemisphere. And so because of the fact that no new factor has entered into their lives, because of the fact that no liberating factor has entered into their lives, they remain in Nicaragua. Now, the people who have fled Cuba, that is an interesting situation. Needless to say, there are classes of criminals, there are classes of people who are wanted in Cuba for crimes against humanity, and most of those people are the same people who in New Orleans have set themselves up in stores with blood money, and who engage in day-to-day trade with New Orleanians. Those are the people who would certainly not want to go back to Cuba, and who would certainly want to flee Cuba. There are other classes. There are peasants who do not like the collectivization in Cuban agriculture. There are others who, for one reason or another, more or less legitimate reasons, reasons of opinion, have fled Cuba. Most of these people flee by legal means. They are allowed to leave after requesting the Cuban government for exit visas. Some of these people, for some reasons or another, do not like to apply for these visas, or they feel that they cannot get them. They flee. They flee Cuba in boats. They flee any way they can go. And I think that the opinion and the attitude of the Cuban government to this is good riddance.
Mr. Oswald, that's very interesting because as a reporter in this field for some time, I've been interviewing refugees for now about 3 years. And I'd say that the last Batista man officially that I talked to left Cuba about 2.5 years ago. The rest of them that I've talked to have been taxi cab drivers, day laborers, cane cutters, and that sort of thing. I thought this revolution was supposed to benefit these people. What is the fair play for Cuba's position on this?
Well, as I say, there are different classes. A minority of class of these people are, as I say, people who were Batista criminals and so forth. It may not be true that the people fleeing nowadays are completely cleansed of Batista elements. Certainly some of these Batistaites have been hiding or have been engaging in counter-revolutionary activities ever since the Bay of Pigs invasion, and even before that, just after the revolution. In other words, they have remained on the ground. Undoubtedly, the overwhelming majority of people during the last year, for instance, who have fled Cuba, have been non-Batistaites, rather peasant class. You say the revolution is supposed to benefit these people. You know, it's very funny about revolutions. Revolutions require work. Revolutions require sacrifice. Revolutions, and our own included, require a certain amount of rationing, a certain amount of calluses, a certain amount of sacrifice, sacrificing one's own personal ideas about country, citizenship, work. And these people who have fled Cuba have not been able to adapt themselves to these new factors which have entered into their lives. These people are the uneducated. These people are the people who did not remain in Cuba to be educated by young people who were afraid of the alphabet, who were afraid of these new things which were occurring, who were afraid that they would lose something by collectivization. They were afraid that they would lose something by seeing their sugar crops taken away, and in place of sugar crops, some other vegetable, some other product planted, because Cuba has always been a one-product country, more or less. These are people who have not been able to adapt.
Mr. Oswald, you say they're sugar crops. Most of the Cubans I've talked to that have had anything to do with agriculture in the last year and a half have not owned one single acre of ground. They were cane cutters.
That is
and
correct.
They're the ones that are fleeing the Castro regime.
That is correct, sir. That is very, very true, and I'm very glad you brought that point up. You know, it used to be that these people worked for the United Fruit Company, the American companies engaged in sugar refinery, oil refinery in Cuba. They worked a few months every year during the cane cutting or the sugar cutting, sugar refining season. They never owned anything, and they feel now that that little bit of right, the right to work for 5 months a year, has been taken away from them. They feel that now they have to work all year round to plant new crops, to make a new economy. And so they feel that they have been robbed. They feel they've been robbed of the right to do as they please because of the fact that the government now depends upon its people to build its economy, to industrialize itself. So they figure they have been robbed. What they do not realize is that they have been robbed of the right to be exploited, robbed of the right to be cheated, robbed of the right of New Orleanian companies to take away what was rightfully theirs. Of course, they have to share now. Everybody gets an equal portion. This is collectivization. Some people prefer the dog-eat-dog economy.
What do you refer to as a dog-eat-dog economy? Is that the committee of the current society about Cuban-U.S. relations?
Well, of course, Americans in general have only begun to notice Cuba since the Cuban Revolution. That is very true, I think. I became acquainted with it at about the same time as everybody else in 1960, beginning in 1960. I always felt that the Cubans were being pushed into this to the Soviet bloc by American policy. I still feel that way. Our policy, if it had been handled differently, and many others much more informed than I, is being pushed into this to the Soviet bloc by American policy. I still feel that way. Our policy, if it had been handled differently, and many others much more informed than I have said the same thing, if that situation had been handled differently, we would not have the big problem of Castro's Cuba now, the big international political problem. Although I feel that it's a just and a right development in Cuba, still we could be on much friendlier relations with them, and had the government of the United States, its government agents, particularly certain covert undercover agencies like the now defunct CIA. And
Now defunct?
Well, its leadership is now defunct. Allen Dulles is now defunct. I believe that without all that meddling, with a little bit different humanitarian handling of the situation, Cuba would not be the problem it is today.
Is there any particular act of the U.S. government, do you feel, that pushed Castro into Soviet arms?
Well, as I say, Castro's Cuba, even after the revolution, was still a one-crop economy, basing its economy on sugar. When we slashed the Cuban sugar quota, of course, we cut their throat. They had to turn to some other country. They had to turn to some other hemisphere in which to sell this one product. They did so, and they have sold it to Russia. And because of that, the price of Russian sugar is now down quite a bit, whereas ours is going up and up and up. And I believe that was the big factor, the cutting of the sugar quota.
Do you think that the U.S. government under President Eisenhower ever wanted to help the Castro regime? Ever offered any sort of help to it?
True to our democratic policies, certain people, certain persons in the government, and certain policies adopted very late, but adopted by the government, helped Fidel Castro while he was still in the mountains. That is very true. We cut off aid to Batista just before the revolution, just before it. That was too late. We had already done more harm than we could have ever done before. We were just rats sinking leaving a sinking ship, you see. That was not the thing to do. We have, however, as I say, helped him. We have not now cut off all that help.
There's one point of view which I've heard to the effect that the Castro turned left because he could not get any aid for industrialization in Cuba from the United States. Does the Fair Play for Cuba Committee
Not how we know. We feel that was a factor, certainly. But we feel that the current of the history of the world is now running to that extreme. In other words, countries emerging from colonial domination and so forth are definitely adopting socialistic, leftist, Marxist, and even in some case what will be in the future communist regimes and communist inclinations. You say this is something which is apparently a world trend.
Is the Fair Play for Cuba believe that this trend should also be copied in the United States?
No, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is occupied only with the Cuban problem. I do not think that they feel that way, no.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oswald. Tonight we've been talking with Lee Oswald, the Secretary of the New Orleans chapter of the Pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba Committee. In subsequent programs, we will present the comments of other leaders concerned with the U.S.-Cuban conflict. Good night.
WDSU Radio presents Conversation Carte Blanche, next on Cavalcade.
It's time now for Conversation Carte Blanche. Here is Bill Slatter.
Good evening. For the next few minutes, Bill Stuckey and I, Bill, whose program you probably heard on Saturday night, Latin Listening Post, Bill and I are going to be talking with three gentlemen, the subject mainly revolving around Cuba. Our guests tonight are Lee Harvey Oswald, who is secretary of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. It's a New York headquartered organization which is generally recognized as the principal voice of the Castro government in this country. Our second guest is Ed Butler, who is executive director of the Information Council of the Americas, which is headquartered in New Orleans and specializes in distributing anti-communist educational materials throughout Latin America. And our third guest is Carlos Brignere, a Cuban refugee and New Orleans delegate of the Revolutionary Student Directorate, one of the more active of the anti-Castro refugee organizations. Bill, at this time, if you'll briefly background the situation as you know it.
Thank you, Bill. First, for those who don't know too much about the background of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, this is an organization that specializes primarily in distributing literature and is based in New York. For the several years in which it's been in existence, it has operated principally out of the East and out of the West Coast and a few college campuses. Recently, however, attempts have been made to organize a chapter here in New Orleans. The only member of the group who has revealed himself publicly so far is 23-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, who is the secretary of the local chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He first came to public notice several days ago when he was arrested and convicted for disturbing the peace. The ruckus in which he was involved started when several local Cuban refugees, including Carlos Brignere, who is with us tonight, discovered him distributing pro-Castro literature on the downtown street. And Mr. Oswald and Bringier are here with us tonight to give us opposing views on the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and its objectives. I believe that I was probably the first New Orleans reporter to interview Mr. Oswald on his activities here since he first came into public view. Last Saturday, in addition to having him on my show, we had a very long and rambling question and answer session over various points of dogma and line of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And now I'll give you a very brief digest of some of the principal propaganda lines. I use the word propaganda, rather I should say informational lines of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Number one, the principal thing that they insist is that Castro's government today is completely free and independent and is in no way controlled by the Soviet Union. Another cardinal point of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee's propaganda is that Premier Castro was forced to seek aid from the Russians only because the United States government refused to offer him financial aid. In following another line, I asked Mr. Oswald if he had ever or was a member of the American Communist Party, and he said that the only organization to which he belonged was the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Mr. Oswald also gave me this rundown on his personal background. He said that he was a native of New Orleans, had attended Beauregard Junior High School and Warren Eastern High School, had entered the U.S. Marine Corps in 1956 and was honorably discharged in 1959. He said during our previous interview that he had lived in Fort Worth, Texas before coming here to establish a Fair Play for Cuba chapter several weeks ago. However, there were a few items apparently that I suspect that Mr. Oswald left out of this original interview, which was principally where he lived between 1959 and 1962. Mr. Butler brought some newspaper clippings to my attention, and I also found some through an independent investigation, Washington newspaper clippings to the effect that Mr. Oswald had attempted to renounce his American citizenship in 1959 and become a Soviet citizen. There was another clipping dated 1952 saying that Mr. Oswald had returned from the Soviet Union with his wife and child after having lived there for 3 years. Mr. Oswald, are these correct?
That is correct, yes.
You did live in Russia for 3 years?
That is correct, and I think the fact that I did live for a time in the Soviet Union gives me excellent qualifications to repudiate charges that Cuba and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is communist controlled.
Mr. Bringier, perhaps you would like to dispute that point.
Well, I want to know exactly the name of the organization that you represent here in the city, because I have some confusion. Is Fair Play for Cuba Committee or Fair Play for Russia Committee?
Well, that is, of course, very provocative and a question I don't think it requires an answer.
Well, I will tell you why. Because before the communists take over Cuba, Cuba was at the head of the Latin American countries, and I can show you that in Cuba, in 1958, every 37 persons has an automobile, and in Russia was 200 persons for one automobile. In Cuba was 6 persons for one radio, and in Russia was 20 persons for one radio. In Cuba was one television set for 18 persons, and in Russia was 85 persons for one television set. And in Cuba was one telephone for every 38 persons, and in Russia was one telephone for every 580 persons. Cuba was selling the sugar in the American market and was receiving from the United States more than $100 million a year over the price of the world market, and the United States was paying to Cuba that price in dollars. Right now, Cuba is selling the sugar to Russia. Russia is paying to Cuba 80% in junks, in machinery from Russia, and 20% in dollar. I think that Cuba right now is a colony of Russia, and the people of Cuba, who is leaving Cuba every day, who is escaping from Cuba every day, they disagree with you that you are representing the people of Cuba. Maybe you will represent the colony of Russia here in this moment, but not the people of Cuba. You cannot take that responsibility.
Well, in order to give a clear and concise and short answer to each of those, well, let's say questions, I would say that the facts and figures from a lower country like Pakistan or Burma would even reflect more light upon Cuba in relation to how many television sets and how many radios and all that. This I do not think is a subject to be discussed tonight. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee, as the name implies, is concerned primarily with Cuban-American relations.
How many people do you have in your committee here in New Orleans?
I cannot reveal that as Secretary of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Is it a secret society?
No, Mr. Butler, it is not. However, it is a set operating procedure for a political organization consisting of a political minority to safeguard the names and the number of its members.
Well, the Republicans are in the minority. I don't see them hiding their membership.
The Republicans are not a, well, the Republicans are a established political party representing a great many people. They represent no radical point of view. They do not have a very violent and sometimes emotional opposition as we do.
No, I see. Well, would you say then that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not a communist front organization?
The Senate subcommittees who have occupied themselves with investigating the Fair Play for Cuba Committee have found that there is nothing to connect the two committees. We have been investigated from several points of view. That is, points of view of taxes, allegiance, aversion, and so forth. The findings have been, as I say, absolutely zero.
Well, I have the Senate hearings before me, and I think what I have in front of me refutes precisely every statement that you just made. For instance, who is the honorary chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee?
The honorary chairman of this committee, the name of that person, I certainly don't know.
Well, let me tell you, in case you don't know about your own organization.
No, I know about it.
His name is Waldo Frank, and I'm quoting from the New Masses in September 1932. The title of his article is How I Came to Communism, a Symposium, by Waldo Frank, Where I Stand and How I Got There. Now, let me ask you a second question. Who is the secretary of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the national secretary?
Well, we have a national director who is Mr. V.T. Lee, who has recently returned from Cuba, and because of the fact that the United States government has imposed restrictions on travel to Cuba, he is now under indictment for his traveling to Cuba. This, however, it's very convenient for rightist organizations to drag out this or that literature purporting to show a fact which has not been established in law. I have said that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee has definitely been investigated. That is very true. I have also said that the total result of that investigation was zero. That is, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not now on the Attorney General's subversive list. Any other material you may have is superfluous.
Mr. Oswald, I may break in a moment. I believe it was mentioned that you at one time asked to renounce your American citizenship and become a citizen of the Soviet Union. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think that has a particular import to this. We're in the Cuban-American relationship.
Well, I think it has a bearing to this extent, Mr. Oswald. You say that Cuba is not dominated by Russia, and yet you apparently, by your own past actions, have shown that you have an affinity for Russia and perhaps communism, although I don't know that you admit that you either are a communist or have been. Could you straighten out that point? Are you or have you been a communist?
Well, I had answered that prior to this program on another radio program.
Are you a Marxist?
Yes, I am a Marxist.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is primarily the difference between a country like Ghana, Guyana, Yugoslavia, China, or Russia. Very, very great differences. Differences which we appreciate by giving aid, let's say, to Yugoslavia in the sum of $100 million or so per year.
What's the difference?
The difference is, as I said, a very great difference. Many parties, many countries are based on Marxism. Many countries, such as Great Britain, display very socialistic aspects and characteristics. I might point to the socialized medicine of Britain.
Most people. Gentlemen, I'll have to interrupt. We'll be back in a moment to continue this rather lively discussion after this message.
And now back to conversation carte blanche. Here again, Bill Slatter.
Tonight, Bill Stuckey and I are talking to Doug Oswald, who is local secretary of a group called Fair Play for Cuba, and with Ed Butler, the executive director of the Information Council of the Americas, and Carlos Briñer, a Cuban refugee, and obviously anti-Castro. Mr. Oswald, as you might imagine, is on the hot seat tonight, and I believe, Bill Stuckey, you have a question for him.
Mr. Oswald, I believe you said in reply to a question from Mr. Butler that any questions about your background were extraneous to the discussion tonight. I disagree because of the fact that you refuse to reveal any of the other members of your organization, so you are the face of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and therefore by starting to let you know more about you. For this reason, I'm curious to notice how you supported yourself during the 3 years that you lived in the Soviet Union. Did you have government subsidy?
Well, as I will answer that question directly then, since you are resting to get your answer. I worked at I was under that is, I was not unprotected. I was at all times considered an American. I did not lose my American citizenship. Did you say? About the situation which live in the Union grant visit is very rarely given.
Je vais faire court ce soir. Juste un petit souci avec le chat de notre ami King Merde. Il me semble qu'il manque. Présentement, il a 123 visionnages en cours. Et regardez combien de participants participent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sur 125 maintenant. 125 visionnages. Et il y a 8 personnes qui laissent des commentaires. J'aimerais vraiment une explication. Parce que il y a un petit souci en quelque part. En tout cas, bonne continuation avec ta Marie. Elle n'insulte pas personne, madame. Présentement, il a 123 visionnages en cours. Et regardez combien de participants participent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sur 125 maintenant. 125 visionnages. Et il y a 8 personnes qui laissent des commentaires. J'aimerais vraiment une explication. Parce que il y a un petit souci en quelque part. En tout cas, bonne continuation avec ta Marie. Il y a un petit souci en quelque part. En tout cas, bonne continuation avec ta Marie. Elle insulte. J'aimerais vraiment une explication. explication. Parce que il y a un petit souci en quelque part. En tout cas, bonne continuation avec ta Marie. Elle n'insulte pas personne, madame.
This requires a certain amount of technicalities, technical papers and so forth. At no time, as I say, did I renounce my citizenship or attempt to renounce my citizenship, and at no time was I out of contact or with the American Embassy.
Excuse me, may I interrupt just 1 second? Either one of these two statements is wrong. The Washington Evening Star of October 31st, 1959, page 1, reported that Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine of 4936 Collingwood Street, Fort Worth, Texas, had turned in his passport at the American Embassy in Moscow on that same date and had said that he had applied for Soviet citizenship. Now, it seems to me that you renounced your American citizenship if you turned in your passport.
Well, the very obvious answer to that is that I'm back in the United States. A person who renounces his citizenship becomes legally disqualified for returning to the United States.
Right, and Soviet authorities, this is from the Washington Post and Times Herald, November 16, 1959, Soviet authorities had refused to grant it, although they had informed him that he could live in Russia as a resident alien. What did you do during the 2 weeks from October 31st to November 16, 1959?
As I've already stated, of course, this is a whole conversation, and we don't have too much time left, is getting away from the Cuban-American problem. However, I'm quite willing to discuss myself for the remainder of this program. As I stated, it is very difficult for a resident, for a foreign.
Appelle-moi camarade, c'est un monde bien malade. Tout le monde s'en bat la rage, pas qui on parlera avec des rimes dans lesquelles parle la rage. Dans cette terre, ceux qui parlaient trop, ils ont jugé nos colons, obscurcissaient leur ciel et les ont publiés de leur sang, ils ont fait leur miel. Silence on tue, silence on assassine, on élimine tous ces illuminés qui voudraient changer le scénario du film. Leur dessin, on les connaît par cœur, je veux pas trop faire le tableau. Ce monde est hardcore, pas très contre les pouvoirs, leur chef-d'œuvre du grand art, y'a qu'à regarder pour pouvoir, on est mort sans savoir comment asphyxier. On perd tout l'oxygène, comment enchaîner la destinée de cité où la peur sereine. J'étouffe, j'aimerais tellement changer d'air, mais au fond, moi j'en bien ces putains d'air qui nous font changer. C'est toute simple question de survie, bien plus qu'une croisade, armée de bras la plus calme. Vamos, camarades!
Je m'appelle Manu. J'ai 40 ans. Et je suis dépressif. La vie était belle, tout me souriait et j'ai commencé à voir des gilets jaunes. Partout, tout le temps. Depuis, je suis sous Xanax.
Gilet jaune, moi gilet jaune, dis-moi les gilets jaunes, faut danser petit. J'ai voulu mettre l'essence, c'est trop cher. J'ai payé les taxes, c'est trop cher. J'ai voulu mettre l'essence, c'est trop cher. J'ai payé les taxes, c'est trop cher. Faut cotiser par-ci, c'est trop cher. Faut cotiser par-là, c'est trop cher. Faut cotiser par-ci, c'est trop cher. Faut cotiser par-là.
La vie était belle, tout me souriait et j'ai commencé à voir des gilets jaunes. Partout, tout le temps. Depuis, je suis sous Xanax.
Ouais, merci aux Français pour donner les idées des prochains records. Je vais passer leur chaîne. LHP, il se lâche bien apparemment, il met des beaux fucks. Ah, il est beau ce drapeau. Ah, il est bien ça. Et une belle gueule.
Yo tout le monde!
Ouais, c'est pas cool, là. C'est la copine de mon pote, toi. On va avoir des au tribunal, déjà depuis la date. Et vous allez vous parler d'un sujet qui est assez important. J'arrête les petits comme drapeau. Et en fait, pourquoi Drouet s'arrache?
Un micro, en vivant, je voulais dire, je voudrais un peu sur les groupes, là, il y a des infos. Parce que Drouet, il a dit qu'il se retirait. Bon, bah, déjà, pour moi, c'est une fiotte. Hein. Ça fait 5 mois qu'on dit on lâche rien. L'autre qui se retire, il est fatigué. Ben, j'ai envie de dire, s'il est fragile, hein, il se retire en silence, il ferme sa gueule. Parce que là-haut, le gouvernement, il doit bien rigoler, Jupiter. Ils doivent se dire l'autre de ça fait 5 mois qu'il nous fait chier. Ben, maintenant, voilà, il se retire. Enfin, ça, c'est une chose. Mais la cagnotte des blessés, là, qu'il a cumulé 180 000 euros, on en fait quoi? Moi, je comptais un peu dessus, tu vois, par rapport à mes frais d'avocat. Il faudrait diffuser un maximum que Drouet, il se retire, mais il se retire aussi avec sa cagnotte de 180 000 balles, tu vois. Donc, j'ai envie de dire, il ne faut peut-être pas lâcher l'affaire comme ça, quoi. Si tu peux faire suivre l'information, la relayer, ben voilà, je te remercie. Merci, mon pote.
Même si beaucoup s'en tapent, s'en foutent.
Bon, mais voilà, en gros, quoi. Après, la vidéo, vous l'avez déjà vue, je pense.
Pourquoi cette pause, même si beaucoup s'en tapent, s'en foutent. Je vais bien expliquer ce que je vis, peut-être par rapport à un simple gilet jaune, que d'ailleurs j'aimerais bien en revenir un petit peu, faire une pause au niveau réseau et tous les autres trucs. Je voulais juste faire la lumière sur beaucoup de personnes dans le mouvement qui prennent trop de temps à critiquer ce que font les autres. Et c'est vraiment usant, et c'est pour beaucoup de personnes aussi. La critique est tellement facile dans un mouvement.
Comme que tu es en train de faire, là.
Et même pas s'attarder sur ce que fait le voisin, ou ce qu'il est, ou je sais pas quoi. Et je vois beaucoup de personnes, il y a quand même pas mal de tri qui seraient à faire sur certains groupes. Beaucoup de personnes qui s'intéressent plus à la vie des autres qu'au mouvement, et ça c'est pas avancer le truc.
On va faire du tri, ouais.
Donc voilà, on verra plutôt ça, je serai moins critiquable et moins attaqué.
Tant mieux. Rodriguez est plus légitime que toi, je pense.
Quand je vois tout ça,
enfin, déjà, il parle mieux.
Toutes ces personnes.
Toi, quand tu parles d'anarchisme, bref, je te coupe, c'est de la merde ce que tu racontes. T'as déjà Drouet, moi.
Donc voilà, au moins, on ne verra plus trop sur les réseaux et je serai moins critiquable et moins attaqué.
Tant mieux. Rodriguez est plus légitime que toi, je pense.
Quand je vois tout ça.
Enfin, déjà, il parle mieux.
Toutes ces personnes.
Toi, quand tu parles d'anarchisme, bref, je te coupe, c'est de la merde ce que tu racontes. T'as déjà Drouet, moi, je t'ai jamais suivi. C'est comme Branco, toute la fine équipe, là, tu vois. Limite, comment il s'appelle?
C'est la vie des autres mouvements et ça fait pas avancer le truc.
On va faire du tri, ouais.
Donc voilà, au moins, on ne verra plus trop sur les réseaux et je serai moins critiquable et moins attaqué.
Tant mieux. Rodriguez est plus légitime que toi, je pense.
Quand je vois tout ça,
Enfin, déjà, il parle mieux.
toutes ces personnes.
Toi, quand tu parles d'anarchisme, bref, je te coupe, c'est de la merde ce que tu racontes. T'as déjà droué, moi, je t'ai déjà pas faire du tri. Ouais.
Donc voilà, au moins, on ne verra plus trop sur les réseaux et je serai moins critiquable et moins attaqué.
Tant mieux. Rodriguez est plus légitime que toi, je pense.
Quand je vois tout ça.
Enfin, déjà, il parle mieux.
Toutes ces personnes.
Toi, quand tu parles d'anarchisme, bref, je te coupe. On va faire du tri, ouais.
Donc voilà, au moins, on ne verra plus trop sur les réseaux et je serai moins critiquable et moins attaqué.
Tant mieux. Rodriguez est plus légitime que toi, je pense.
Quand je vois tout ça.
Enfin, déjà, il parle mieux.
Toutes ces personnes.
Toi, quand tu parles d'anarchisme, bref, je te coupe, c'est de la merde ce que tu racontes. T'as déjà droué, moi, je t'ai jamais suivi. C'est comme Branco, toute la fine équipe. Là. Tu vois. Limite, comment il s'appelle, Nicole, lui, bon, ben voilà, quoi. Lui, il apprend au jour le jour, mais justement, il apprend bien, quoi. Toi, il apprend de ses erreurs. Toi, on voit là que t'es en termes de profil, là, déjà, tu vis toujours chez ta mère ou avec ta mère, on s'en bat les couilles, quoi. Et etc., quoi. Et comment ça s'appelle, Priscilla, là, oui, c'est plus légitime. Après, qui c'est qu'il y a d'autres, Rodriguez, je crois qu'il est légitime, mais vous avez essayé de l'engrainer. Puis alors, Ramous, on n'en parle même pas, là, qui s'est cru pour G.I. Joe ce week-end. Ramous, franchement, alors lui, on voit la vidéo, ils m'ont cassé le nez, ils m'ont cassé le machin. En fait, comme si c'était jeté sur les matraques des keufs, ou tu vois, c'est ça, pour protéger Jérôme. Non, mais attends, Rodriguez, il peut pas se rendre tout seul. Enfin, voilà, quoi. Voilà mon avis sur tout ça. Et puis, ben, force à vous tous. Et puis, ben, on verra bien ce que ça va donner à l'avenir. Allez, ciao les amis.
Ils seront, je crois, à la droite du président. Les membres du gouvernement seront là. À la droite du président. Les membres du gouvernement. Ce sont celles qui vont s'installer. Ils seront, je crois, à la droite du président. Les membres du gouvernement seront là. Du président. Les membres du gouvernement seront là. Les vides qu'on a vus, ce sont celles qui vont s'installer. Ils seront, je crois, à la droite du président. Les membres du gouvernement seront là.
En ce moment, les Français sont capables d'entendre ce message et de l'accepter. Pourquoi pas, mais on leur a fait le coup déjà de travailler plus pour gagner plus. Ils en ont conservé un souvenir avec des points d'interrogation. Au-delà de ça, je trouve qu'on n'arrive pas dans ce pays à sortir de ce débat infernal. Ça fait presque 30 ans que nous sommes en débat sur le temps de travail. Je suis retourné aux arguments qui ont été présentés au moment de des deux lois Aubry. Je suis même remonté au débat parlementaire de 1982, au moment de la semaine de 39 heures. On a le sentiment qu'on est totalement congelé dans une guerre de position, avec à peu près toujours les mêmes arguments qui sont renvoyés les uns aux autres, avec toujours cette espèce de grande question. Est-ce que les Français, nous serions un peuple de paresseux? Voilà, il y a toujours cette question lancinante qui revient, et on a le sentiment qu'on n'arrive pas à aller de l'avant, qui est sur effectivement comment on travaille, comment on redonne des marges de possibilités tout au long de la vie pour se former, pour s'éduquer, qu'on aille un peu de l'avant, enfin, qu'on arrête avec ce débat rétrospectif.
Enfin, qu'ils utilisent leurs armes,
Oui, mais c'est une mesure que va annoncer le chef de l'État. Ce soir, on a bien compris que tout le monde ne pourra pas être d'accord. Est-ce qu'il y aura quand même des gagnants? À tout de suite.
À tout de suite.
Parce que c'est un jeu de perdant et de gagnant pour eux, le grand débat.
Regardez votre programme.
C'est génial.
Attends, on va couper les pubs.
Protection loyer, l'assurance.
Ta gueule! Ta gueule! Il n'y a pas d'adblock sur les télés et ça fait vraiment très chier.
À quand la censure? La vraie censure. Des publicitaires, des politiques dépravés de toutes ces sociétés occultes qui font aucun culte de fausses morale à nos enfants. Tes descendants sont déjà dans le sens inverse de l'abrutissement sélectionné, de la pensée collective outragée par ces cons de le dire ici, les idéaux logiques de la franc-maçonnerie. Ça fait chier. Mais je suis obligé d'interrompre ce couplet si tu veux pas que ça se termine en sombre idée macabre. qu'on finisse tous assis sous la table, comme pendant un séisme à Séoul. Alors qu'en fait, c'est juste qu'ils nous recherchent pendant qu'on... Ouais, yo tout le monde. Je voulais vous montrer un truc. Là, je viens de voir ça. Je trouve ça trop marrant. Chez MCM, franchement, ceux qui programment les pubs, ils trollent, quoi. Regardez ça.
Utile pour tous et pour chacun. En donnant de notre énergie, on se découvre une vraie force.
Le pouvoir d'être utile.
Service civique, une mission pour chacun au service de tous.
T'as vu la transition de ouf? Service civique, Subway. Oh, ils ont trollé chez MCM. Ah, là, c'est fort, là, c'est fort. Allez, boy, les amis. Subway. Oh, ils ont trollé chez MCM. Ah, là, c'est fort, là, c'est fort. Allez, boy, les amis. Oh, putain. Oh, les trolls de chez MCM. Ah, les trolls.
Non, c'est surtout qu'il y a une volonté des forces de l'ordre de disperser cette manifestation au plus vite. De toute façon, on la sent-tu. Volonté des forces de l'ordre de disperser cette manifestation au plus vite. De toute façon, on la sent-tu. C'est surtout qu'il y a une volonté des forces de l'ordre de disperser cette manifestation au plus vite.
Manu.
De toute façon, on l'a senti, dès le début de la manifestation.
Ah oui.
Les forces de l'ordre ont pour mission.
Puis c'est sur la Pacifle au mois de février. Hier je me disais encore que le printemps revenait. Puis c'est sur de la Pacifle au mois de février. Hier
all the unbelievers. It's all getting right. Sing all of deceivers. We are the sickness song. Why the fuck did you take him away from us, you motherfucker? Peaks again.
During those 2 weeks and during the days you mentioned, I was for within hours of the American economy to get into unit. You're going to go to the level to unit class to the
Why the fuck did you take him away from us, you motherfucker?
We are in a minority, so we are not particularly what people take now, or rightist members of rightist organizations have to say. We are primarily the United States government towards Cuba, and that's the way we are striving to get the United States to adopt measures more friendly towards Cuban people and the Cuban regime in that country. We are not at all communist strong, regardless of the fact that I have the experience of living in Russia, regardless of the fact that we have been investigated, regardless of many of those facts. The best way to do it is an independent organization, not affiliated with any other organization. And our ideals are very clear. I would not agree with that particular word. I am the United States fear of activity of, let's say, very automatic communist I would say that the activities of the United States government in regard to Cuba were a manifestation of not enough support for Fidel Castro, but rather a withdrawal of support from the Cuba. In other words, we stopped parliament to the Cuba. With the Eurobomb, with the Texas parliament and dropped it into Sierra Leone, where Cuba is reducing its product as far as sugarcane goes. It is striving to grow unlimited and unheard of for Cuba quantities of certain vegetables, sweet potatoes, lima beans, cotton, and so forth, so that they can become agriculturally independent.
Gentlemen, I'm going to have to interrupt you. Our time's almost up. We've had three guests tonight on Conversation Carte Blanche. Bill Stuckey and I have been talking with Lee Harvey Oswald, Secretary of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, Ed Butler, Executive Director of the Information Council of the Americas, and Carlos Brinier, a Cuban refugee. Thank you very much.
Le président qui a été tué, c'était il y a 50 ans exactement. Vous étiez à l'université de Yale pour un reportage pour 5 colonnes à la une et vous allez être l'un des grands témoins d'un des plus grands événements de l'histoire que vous racontez aujourd'hui dans un formidable livre aux éditions Gallimard. Vous avez vécu là l'histoire en direct.
Bien sûr, j'ai vécu d'abord la nouvelle elle-même, comme tous les Américains. J'ai vécu, cette nouvelle s'est répandue peu à peu. À l'époque, vous n'avez pas de chaîne Tout Info, il n'y a pas de portable, il n'y a pas de prompteur, il n'y a pas de Facebook, il n'y a pas de Twitter. Donc, ça se répand un peu doucement. Mais il y a les radios.
Oui.
Et donc, petit à petit, j'ai vécu le deuil, la sidération, la stupéfaction, la peur et le chagrin.
Oui. Alors, vous étiez donc à l'université de Yale pour un reportage pour 5 colonnes à la une. On vous apprend ce qui vient de se passer. Vous prenez immédiatement l'avion, vous allez à New York, puis vous rendez à Dallas. Et là, vous découvrez, comme vous le dites, une ville complètement sidérée avec une sorte de bordel général.
Bah, pas dans les rues, mais à l'intérieur du commissariat de police où j'arrive, le Dallas Police Headquarters, c'est un grand foutoir. Hein. Il y a quand même 300-400 journalistes qui sont là parce que la nuée, la presse entière qui débarque. Vous avez des câbles de télévision partout, c'est lourd à l'époque, c'est pas du tout la technique d'aujourd'hui. Vous avez des appareils de photo, vous savez, ces gros appareils qui envoient le magnésium, les flashs et tout. Au milieu de tout ça, de cette foule, il y a autant de policiers que de journalistes pratiquement, et au milieu de tout cela, le petit brave Oswald qui débarque de sa cellule du 5e vers le bureau du capitaine Fritz, avec qui j'ai longuement parlé ensuite, très intéressant personnage, pour être interrogé au 3e.
Et moi, vous êtes donc au Dallas Police Headquarters.
Ouais.
Tout se passe là entre le 5e et le 3e étage. Vous racontez dans ce livre, vous voyez Oswald.
Bien sûr, je vois comme je vous vois. Oui.
Et qu'est-ce qu'il vous inspire?
Il m'inspire quand même beaucoup de choses parce que je trouve qu'il a un visage très intéressant d'un homme qui sait très bien ce qu'il veut, ce qu'il a fait ou ce qu'il veut faire. Un rictus, d'une manière de dire « j'en sais plus que vous et je suis peut-être l'homme le plus important du moment dans le monde. J'ai commis, enfin, c'est mon interprétation, oui. J'ai commis un geste historique. »
Oui, mais il ne dit pas qu'il a tué quelqu'un.
Jamais. Il ne nie pas non plus. Attention, la première phrase qu'il prononce quand il est arrêté quelques heures auparavant dans un cinéma, où il s'est réfugié après avoir tué un flic. Il ne faut jamais oublier qu'il a tué un policier 45 minutes après avoir tiré sur Kennedy. C'est pour quand même qu'il n'est pas tout à fait innocent. Si vous tuez un policier qui contrôle votre identité, il y a une raison. Donc il est dans le cinéma, on l'arrête, et le premier policier qui l'arrête lui dit « Est-ce que vous avez tiré sur le président ?» Et Oswald dit « Find out for yourself. » trouvez-le vous-même. En d'autres termes, débrouillez-vous. C'est pas à moi à vous dire. Mais il n'a pas nié.
Oui.
Il n'a pas dit non.
Oui, il n'a pas dit vous, vous restez là, vous vivez l'histoire, vous le voyez qui arrive et qui remonte pour se faire interroger. Et puis vous rencontrez un type qui s'appelle Jack Ruby, qui se promène là, vous vous dites qu'est-ce qu'il fiche là? Il vous donne sa carte.
Tout à fait. Oui, bien sûr. Carte de boîte de nuit, c'est un tenancier d'une boîte de nuit, le Carousel Club, qu'il a fermé en signe de deuil. Qu'est-ce qu'il fait là, en effet? Là, il y a quoi? Il y a des policiers et la presse.
C'est un gros type comme
tout.
ça, vous dites qu'il respire une certaine vulgarité.
Il est épais, oui, il a la vulgarité d'un tenancier de boîte de nuit, c'est tout, avec une bagouze, avec une cravate de soie. Mais
il vous dit venez boire un verre dans mon bar.
Oui, sauf qu'il dit aussi qu'il a fermé en signe de deuil. Mais surtout, il est là. Mais il connaît tout le monde. Tout le monde le connaît. La presse locale et les policiers, nous, on ne le connaît pas. La presse locale, on le connaît très bien. Parce qu'il passe sa vie dans les salles de rédaction et au commissariat de police. C'est un groupie.
Oui.
Vous voyez ce que je veux dire?
Ce qui est extraordinaire, c'est que les événements, vous dites des concours de circonstances à répétition vont se produire, c'est que donc, il va assassiner Oswald. À ce moment-là, vous, le jeune journaliste, vous êtes, évidemment, à l'époque, c'est pas la même qu'aujourd'hui. Vous êtes au téléphone, vous êtes obligé de dicter vos articles pour France Soir, et là, vous dites, c'est mon ratage, le ratage de ma vie.
Oui, mais je n'ai pas honte de le dire, parce que je pense que quand on raconte des choses pareilles, il faut le dire là. Et en même temps, je prends le téléphone, je traverse la rue, j'ai la chance d'être juste de l'autre côté de la rue, et je suis arrivé au garage pour voir pandémonium, il appelle ça le pandémonium. C'est le capharnaüm, c'est la confusion. Et donc, très bien, ayant un peu raté l'événement lui-même, je m'en suis beaucoup voulu. Hein.
Oui.
Je le revois tout de suite devant les télés locales, parce qu'il y avait les caméras.
Et là, vous interrogez tout le monde, vous avez envie de tout savoir.
Ben, j'étais pas seul, hein. On a tous interrogé tout le monde. Et surtout, j'ai fait une belle enquête très approfondie sur qui était lui-même, ce Roby. Les dernières heures de sa vie, avant, la veille. Faut pas oublier que ça faisait 2 jours qu'il n'arrêtait pas de dire qu'il fallait tuer Oswald. Que c'était un son of a bitch, un petit saligo, qu'il avait tué son grand président.
Vous dites, il a espèce de rat. Il aurait dit, on le tuera, espèce de rat.
Non, il a dit you son of a bitch.
Ah oui, c'est fils de pute, carrément.
Ouais, fils de pute, petit salaud, c'est ça que ça veut dire.
On a l'impression qu'on vit un film, un polar. Vous dites dans ce livre, j'avais l'impression, moi, j'étais jeune journaliste, j'avais l'impression que je vivais comme ça, comme dans un cinéma.
Mais je revoyais les films policiers américains que j'ai adoré quand j'étais gamin, dans les années 50. Sauf que, en même temps, j'étais là. Et je me suis dit, arrête de penser au polar. Tu vis le polar, il est là.
Alors, on va voir les images de Zapruder, donc ces images incroyables de cet assassinat du président Kennedy. Mais dans ce très beau livre, vous faites un portrait du président américain et de Jackie et de son courage et de l'Amérique de l'époque.
Oui, tout à fait, parce que vous avez raison et je vous remercie de le dire. Je ne parle pas seulement de Dallas. J'essaie de décrire l'époque, les 60s, l'Amérique, le tournant historique qu'a représenté Kennedy et le personnage de Kennedy. Personnage passionnant.
Oui, vous dites il a été tué là, il aurait pu être tué plus tard. Il aurait certainement été tué ailleurs.
Oui, d'abord parce qu'il attirait autant la haine que l'amour, et que deuxièmement, lui-même, d'une certaine façon, s'attendait à le tuer. Il n'arrêtait pas de parler de sa mort. Il n'arrêtait pas de dire, voilà, il a dit à son épouse, tu vois, hier, là, de la fenêtre, avec un fusil, on aurait très bien pu me flinguer.
Oui, vous dites quelque part, la mort lui a donné la place qu'il a aujourd'hui.
Évidemment, puisque c'est son frère aîné qui devait être le candidat possible à la présidence. Son frère aîné meurt pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Donc c'est la mort du frère qui m'a fait monter le cadet.
Oui.
Donc la mort joue un rôle dans la vie, comme chacun sait.
Alors, un visage incroyable, c'est Jackie, hein, donc qui garde cette robe maculée de sang en disant « je veux qu'on voit ce qu'ils ont fait ».
Oui, parce que elle, comme la famille, a tout de suite pensé, c'était le Texas, c'était les saligots d'extrême droite, les ségrégationnistes.
Mais pourtant, elle n'a jamais cru au complot, et vous non plus d'ailleurs.
Bah, j'ai beaucoup hésité, hein, j'ai beaucoup balancé, parce qu'il y a les hypothèses sur le complot sont très intéressantes et très logiques et très intelligentes, et en même temps, moi je suis un journaliste, comme vous, il y a les faits, il y a les preuves. Or, les preuves que c'est Oswald sont sûres, sont tangibles, les autres preuves, elles sont hypothétiques. Donc, ma phrase clé sur cette affaire de complot, c'est de dire c'est lié à Oswald jusqu'à preuve du contraire.
Oui, mais vous pensez qu'il l'a fait seul? C'est ça la grande question.
Ah non, je ne pense pas. Je ne suis pas le seul. Vous savez, il y a des centaines de journalistes, biographes, historiens, spécialistes qui pensent comme moi aussi.
Oui.
Hein.
Vous allez être interrogé par la commission Warren à Paris.
Vous êtes très fier de figurer dans l'enquête sur Kennedy. Votre nom est cité.
Oui, je l'étais à l'époque, mais ça c'est infantile. Ce qui compte, c'est que ça m'a permis de voir à quel point ils étaient quand même méticuleux, parce qu'ils sont venus des États-Unis pour m'interroger, parce que j'avais simplement passé 5 à 8 minutes avec Jacobi.
C'est un livre formidable, Philippe Labro. On a tiré sur le président chez Gallimard. Merci d'avoir été notre invité aujourd'hui.
Je vous en prie, merci beaucoup.
Getting back to Epstein for a minute, he came back from the interview with Epstein, and that's when the tragedy happened. Did he say anything to you about Epstein, or was he upset when he came back from
No, I talked to him and I said, how's everything going? He said, everything is fine. I said, how's Mr. Epstein? He said, oh, he's very nice, very intelligent. I said, do you have to go and see him again today? And my father said, no, I don't have to go and see him until tomorrow, which I understand was not true.
Wait a minute, you understand that was not true?
No, we had an appointment with Mr. Epstein at 3 o'clock, but he told me that he didn't have to go back.
Did you find out what went wrong there?
No.
You didn't talk to Epstein at all after that?
No, I did speak to Mr. Epstein, and he doesn't know.
The House of Representatives set up a committee to investigate the murders of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. It was chaired by Ohio Congressman Louis Stokes.
Never again should our society respond as it did in the aftermath of the deaths of these two great leaders. We did not give these men the type of investigations in depth which were commensurate with the dignity of their lives. We cannot, of course, rewrite history. We cannot bring back President John F. Kennedy or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But the past can be a guide for the future. We can and we must promise ourselves that this history will never be again repeated in this nation. I thank you.
The committee was the first official body since the Warren Commission to investigate the death of President Kennedy. It ran into immediate trouble.
The experience with the House Committee, with the CIA, with the FBI, with so many other government agencies, with the Army, with military intelligence, it has always been that these agencies and these institutions were reluctant helpers in attempting to find out the truth about the Kennedy assassination. Can the government investigate itself adequately? No, I don't believe it can.
There's nothing further.
A struggle erupted at the committee level over the direction of the investigation, and it seemed at first as if the committee would never get properly.
Eh bien, dis donc, on a de la data sur cette chaîne. Il faut être bilingue. Père français, mère américaine. Elle est de 1987. La date de naissance m'échappe. Où est-ce que j'ai vu ça? Le 24 août 1987. C'est française, c'est sa mère. Avec un Américain. Oups. Est-ce que les informations renseignées sont exactes? Je crois que oui. C'est une réelle journaliste de terrain. Aïe, 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 c'est vrai qu'il y a cette voix. A vraiment besoin de se voir. C'est aussi les mots possibles. Pourquoi n'arriverait-on pas à sortir le train d'une voix ressentie au fond d'un merveilleux foyer de mademoiselle? Je suis encore trompé, et encore cette vie parsemée de rêves, mais parfois de vous intéresser vraiment. Depuis la sang, passionnément mignon, que pourrait-on bien retrouver? M'attirer les charmes de cette agréable yeux fermés, sans expression affichée sur sa petite chaîne de mérite ne soyons pas gênés de dire que pourquoi pas. Paraît honnête, objectif, rien d'autre que des témoignages rejointés, distribués tous les attentifs du moment. Pourquoi n'est-on pas le courage d'être autre que cette avidité proposée? Je n'ai guère de chemin conditionné, c'est une des aguerries à soin. Pour lire bien, le rejeter ne sert à rien, pourtant je souhaiterais uniquement une chose, voir avènement de mes outils, imaginer au fond d'un cœur endurci. Pourquoi ne pas refaire cette petite maison dans la prairie, dans le passé de son vivant? Pourquoi ne tenter de trouver un équilibre parfait au fond de tes deux fragments? Pourquoi ne pas rêver d'un avenir meilleur que radieux calmement? Pourquoi ne pas rêver d'un doux commun? Pourquoi à se laisser aller au de trouver un équilibre, chercher à deux, impossible à trouver, une ambition, refuse d'atteindre toute forme d'équilibre. Quand de cette fameuse complémentarité naturelle ressentie voulue par un ensemble isolé des chaînes qui sont tous souffrir de la souffrir de l'amour partagé une fois dans une vie, ça serait une ah. Bon, bon, moi, j'ai respecté le format. Jamais on n'entendra tout ça. Que pourrais-je donc bien dire? Ouais, je suis dit comme ça. La joue belle. Je me mets il y a plein. C'est dans la boîte. Oh, la gueule que j'ai. Oh, et là, t'as peur.